Hello, my name's Nick Wallace from In Psychedelia. You're about to hear the Yarra Drug and Health Forum pre-election event, recorded on Thursday the 8th of November 2018 at Richmond Town Hall. You'll hear from Richard Wynne, current MP for the seat of Richmond for the Labor Party, Judy, the Reason Party candidate contesting the seat of Richmond, Stephen Jolly, Socialist candidate seeking to secure a seat in the Upper House for the Northern Metropolitan region, Fiona Patten, current Upper House member for the Northern Metropolitan region for the Reason Party, and Nina Springle, current Upper House member for the South Eastern Metropolitan region for the Greens and also their health spokesperson. Chair of the Yarra Drug and Health Forum, Peter Wearne, introduces the event, with Executive Officer Greg Denham hosting the event. For information on future Yarra Drug and Health Forum events, head to ydhf.org.au, and to hear more forums and discussions like this, find In Psychedelia at 3cr.org.au and subscribe to the podcast.
Before we start, I'd just like to thank you all for coming, and I'd like to thank our panellists for making their time available. We are awaiting Ms Fiona Patten, who's informed us that she was had a commitment that just came up at the last minute, but she will be here. She's just running a little bit late, and Fiona will be the last of our speakers. But before we get into the formal part, we need to do something that's really important. That's acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on, the people of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. Pay our respects to all their elders past and present, and to pay our respects to the enormous contribution that Indigenous culture and Indigenous caretaking and stewardship of the land that we're meeting on, that they have played over thousands of years. So we'd also like to acknowledge any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people that are in the audience today. So as I said before, my name is Peter Wearne. I'm the chairperson of the Yarra Drug and Health Forum, and I'm a little bit under the weather, so I'm going to have a more limited role today than I normally do. We've run, at the Yarra Drug and Health Forum, we've been running these types of pre-election forums, I think now for 18 years, both at a federal level and a state level. And we've been really pleased about the enormous response that we've always got from candidates. I'm always amazed that people are always rapt to come and speak and present their personal and party views at these forums. So we really want to acknowledge the great support that all parties have made to this event. We'd also like to say too that we were contacted this morning by the Liberal Party of Victoria, Emma Keeley's office, saying that they would not be providing a spokesperson today, in line with their decision to not run a candidate in this current state election in this current seat of Richmond. So they are a no-show. The other thing that I'd like to say, and this is a matter of the record and it's not party political, is that everyone sitting at this table, and including Fiona Patten, are strong supporters of the establishment of the medically supervised injecting facility at North Richmond, and we'd like to acknowledge everybody's work and support in doing that. It's also fair to say that the Liberal Party policy is to close that facility if they are elected to government. That is their stated political position and public policy. So I think in fairness people need to know that, because we are the Yarra Drug and Health Forum, and part of our advocacy over more than 20 years has been for a sensible approach to drug policy and evidence-informed practice. So the format's going to be that each speaker is going to be invited to speak for 10 minutes, and I'll keep time of that. And I'll let speakers know after 8 minutes that they've got 2 minutes left. Mr Richard Wynne will be our first speaker. Ms Nina Springle from the Greens will be our second speaker. Mr Steve Jolly from the Victorian Socialist Party will be our third speaker, and Fiona Patten from the Reason Party will be our fourth speaker. After the presentations are completed, there'll be a time of Q&A, which Greg Denham, our Executive Officer from the Yarra Drug and Health Forum, will facilitate. So it gives me great pleasure to invite our first speaker to the podium, Mr Richard Wynne from the Australian Labor Party. Richard's had a long and distinguished career in local government, former Lord Mayor of Melbourne, and also has held the seat of Richmond for 19 years. Richard has a background in social work and studied criminology, and he's worked at community health and on inner city public housing estates prior to his political career. Richard was elected in 1999 and has held the position of Parliamentary Secretary for Justice during the first term of the Bracks government and became the Cabinet Secretary after the re-election of that government in 2002. He was elected the member for Richmond in 2014 state election and was appointed Minister for Planning in the new Andrews Labor government following its election win. Richard's also had a long history of working around Indigenous issues and Indigenous rights and in housing. So it's with great pleasure that I invite Richard to the podium.
Thanks, Peter. So, Peter, thank you very much for your very kind introduction and for the opportunity to have a conversation with people with an interest in alcohol and drug issues. Nina, obviously my parliamentary colleague, I welcome her today. Steve, both our councillor and of course upper house candidate, who's running in the northern Metro province for the upper house, and in the absence of Fiona, who will be here with us shortly. She of course also is one of our parliamentary colleagues as well. And I'll say a little bit about Fiona's work in my presentation today. I'm reminded of the Yarra Drugs and Health Forum and its journey, because it's been a journey, Peter. Oh, and I should also acknowledge Greg, of course, Greg Denham, the executive officer of the forum. I am reminded of the genesis of the forum because it actually mirrors basically my entire time in public life here as the representative of the Labor Party in the seat of Richmond. And for all of that time, I think that the forum has had a very particular focus, and it's managed its longevity, I think, speaks to not only the leadership and the commitment that people like Sam and others have provided over that journey, but I think a real sense in which people who often have come together from organisations or from the community with quite disparate views about how to address some of the social issues that we are confronting in our community, but we're able to both listen and I think acknowledge that at times there were disparate views and try to find a way to reach a consensus position. Because for many organisations that are loosely bound together, they tend to break away, and this has not been the case. And I've been very pleased to be a part of that journey with you, and indeed we funded the Yarra Drug and Health Forum on a number of initiatives over that period of time. But I guess today's about really reflecting to some extent on where that journey has come from and what my party has been doing in relation to making commitments around alcohol and drug investment. And I think it is best epitomised by what we achieved in the 2018-19 budget, and this is really the fantastic work of my colleague Martin Foley. It includes a record investment of nearly $260 million in drug services, an increase of 57% over the last 4 budgets. And in that budget, we announced $57 million in new investment, which will support the development of a new residential treatment facility in the Grampians and 3 new residential rehabilitation facilities in regional Victoria, and also supporting minor infrastructure and capital works in existing facilities, particularly those that are dealing with obviously mental health and drug issues. You'll all be well aware of our $184 million ICE action plan, and that's rolling out across Victoria, and so of course is our $87 million drug rehabilitation plan. And the centrepiece of that plan, I don't need to tell any of you here what that's about, it is of course 100 new residential rehab beds which have opened earlier this year. This means with all of our investments over the last 3 years, the government has committed more than double the number of residential rehabilitation beds available in Victoria. We commenced the 4-year term with 208 beds in late 2014, and with this investment we will have 470 beds across Victoria. Our strategy, pretty much for the whole of my time in government, has been about harm minimisation. I mean, that's essentially been the public policy position that we have taken, and we've done a lot of work in that space, whether it's needle and syringe programs and the like. We think that, and I know that there's been incredible advocacy for the medically supervised injecting facility, and I know just how passionate people like Greg were, and I have to acknowledge Greg. I mean, he and I have had many tough conversations about, from his point of view and from the Yarra Drugs and Health Forum, why the hell does this government not support it? I guess there are a range of ways that you can go about changing public policy, and I think it is fair to say, and I think the Premier himself acknowledged that he changed his position. And he changed his position on the basis of data and on the basis of the best research and advice that he could be provided with. And I commend him for that. What role I may have played in assisting him in his thinking around that, well, that's for others to judge. But the reality is that we did change our position, and it's a position that I am immensely proud of. I commenced my advocacy for a medically supervised injecting facility in 1999. It was in fact on the first pamphlet that I actually put out. So I've travelled that road, and it's been a hard road to travel, but it's one that I think is reaping success. A couple of elements of that. In talking to the medical director, Nico Clark, who's just a superb person, the number of people who are visiting the facility is in excess of what they thought they might get coming in. Secondly, the number of resuscitations is, I think, getting towards 200 now. Now, in the context of Nico's experience, he would argue that many of those people would have died. Many of those people would have died. And we can't forget that prior to the opening of this facility, 35 people died last year in and around the North Richmond public housing estate, and died needless, cruel, sad and lonely deaths. And that's something that I think we want to actually put into the past. We acknowledge it, but we want to put that into the past. Because the reality is this facility is saving people's lives. The other beautiful thing about it is that because this is a wraparound service, the difference between us and New South Wales facility is that theirs is a standalone supervised facility. We have all of the wraparound services available, so the people who are accessing the facility can then also go and see the doctors. If they've got a hepatitis issue, they can go and talk to the social workers. They go and talk to the housing support workers, so that they can actually what Demos Kruskos, the CEO of the facility, of the community health centre, says, help people on the road to recovery, because that's ultimately what we're about, saving people's lives, but saying there are other alternatives available to you than continuing on with the behaviours that many of them have exhibited. That's not to say that it's all a bed of roses, but I do want to indicate that certainly from the point of view of the school, the principal of the school and the school council have been not only supportive, they are very, very pleased with what the facility has meant in terms of changing behaviours around the school. I remember somebody coming up to me at a street stall. A gentleman came up to me and he said, I want to talk to you about the supervised injecting facility. And he said, I thought, oh, here we go. He said, I had to resuscitate somebody in the grounds of the school. People were shooting up in the car park. That is no longer the case. I mean, they are delighted by this. The detritus and the needles and so forth, I think we've got a fair way to go still. The pickup program is going okay, but there is still a lot of pockets where people are inappropriately disposing of their syringes, so we have to do better in that. There are still a lot of people who are in fact not using the facility and still using back lanes, and we have to be more aggressive, I think, in our outreach to those people and some of the behaviours are really quite inappropriate. So there's a long way to go, but I think the early suggestions from my point of view, and indeed I think from the facility and the health centre itself, is that we are doing well. We certainly are supporting more people than what was anticipated, and I'm really pleased that our government is committed to this project for 2 years initially, and potentially a further year. It will be independently assessed, and that's entirely appropriate. Obviously, if the election does not travel in the way that I hope it will travel, it will be a very sad day if the alternative government comes in, as they have committed to, and close a much-needed facility in our area which is saving people's lives. Thank you.
Okay. It's with great pleasure I invite Nina Springle to the podium. Nina became the first Greens MP to represent the South Eastern Metropolitan region in Victoria's Parliament in 2014. She brings over a decade's experience in social justice, women's rights, public health and community development. In fact, I know personally that Nina was very active in the southeast of Melbourne in community campaigning and community activity and advocacy. Nina has worked as a consultant in the community and education sector for over a decade. She brings dedication to healthy outcomes in the community to everything she does, whether it's developing policy for the Centre for Excellence for Child and Family Welfare, acting CEO of Asbestos Wise, or writing educational resources for the TAFE Centre. Nina is well established in the southeast of Melbourne, where she raises her children and in the family home built by her grandfather in the 1960s. She loves the diversity of the electorate, which represents the full social and economic range of multicultural Melbourne. Nina is also the drug and alcohol spokesperson for the Greens. Welcome, Nina.
Thank you very much. And I would like to start by acknowledging that we meet here on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Listening to Richard talk about the health and well-being of communities and how important harm minimisation is in terms of drug and alcohol has made me rethink my speech. I do have a very prepared speech here, and I will point to that towards the end. But I want to talk a little bit about why it is so important that we start to redirect our attention away from law and order in relation to drug and alcohol use and towards a health perspective and approach to how we deal with these problems in our community. And I suppose I'm going to go right back to a personal story of mine, which is that my parents were heroin addicts in the 70s, and I lived with, I'm the only child of that partnership, and I lived with the stigma of being the child of two heroin addicts for a long, long time. And in the end of my father's life, he died when I was 23, so it was over 20 years ago. It was a very, very drawn-out, painful and unpleasant death. He died of hepatitis C and cirrhosis of the liver, because after he finished using heroin, he turned to alcohol, which is often a very common thing for people who have addictive personalities. They'll go from one drug to another. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. But as a family member who supported someone through that experience, it was debilitating in many ways. And for that very reason alone, I think we can say these issues don't just impact the addict or the user, but all of the people around them, their family, their friends, their community, and on and on and on. And for that reason alone, if nothing else, we need to start re-diverting our attention away from law and order. Not only does it not really work, but it's expensive, and it perpetuates this cycle that we can see from where we are right now. It doesn't work. And so I congratulate the government for their investment in, the substantial investments they've made over the last year or two into this area of public policy. I sat on the inquiry with Fiona into the medically supervised injecting room, and I mean, you know, it was a little bit like preaching to the converted, to be perfectly honest, because I did go in very supportive of that particular facility, and you know, coming from my background, you would probably think that would be the case. As is pointed out, I have a substantial experience out in the southeast working in the youth justice space as well. So you've got, a big drug and alcohol misuse problem within a young cohort of people out there that you know, and all of those issues around mental health and homelessness and family violence and a whole bunch of other things are intertwined with that, and we actually need to start looking at these issues holistically. We can't look at them in isolation. And so it was very, very gratifying when the government changed their policy and opened the centre. And the stats are very pleasing to hear in such a short amount of time. And so I suppose from my perspective, the Greens are very much of the opinion that we're still focusing far too much on law and order. And that's costing us money, and it's not particularly effective. At a national level, 66% of government expenditure is allocated to law enforcement when it comes to drug and alcohol. 21% to treatment and 9% to prevention, 2% to harm reduction. We really need to flip that. We really, really need to flip that. And until we start spending more on the other areas of public health other than law enforcement, the longer it will take for us to see outcomes. So our platform going into this election is very much genuinely about focusing on a harm minimisation approach to drug and alcohol. We need to start getting serious about the social and economic factors that influence risk behaviour and the health of drug users. And so our platform really does centre around moving in that direction. It's not a catch-all, it's not a fix-all, but we are looking at some interventions that will actually start that transition over to a genuine public health perspective. There's been some particularly impressive and extensive policy work that's come out of the sector in the past years, including from YSAS and from VADA and many others. They outline the huge challenges we face and propose comprehensive solutions at a systemic level. And so we support those recommendations that have been put forward by those organisations, particularly VADA's election priority statements and YSAS's 10-point plan. Both organisations outline progressive big picture reform, and that definitely needs to happen. We're absolutely committed to expanding the safe injecting facilities, building on experience of Richmond and a clear need in other parts of Melbourne and regionally as well. The Greens absolutely support YSAS's push for expanding and improving AOD services and support for young people. Inadequate services are resulting in vulnerable people facing more complex and urgent problems and addiction as time goes on, and it's completely unsustainable. I think we all can see that. And of course, it isn't just impacting, as I said, on themselves, but their families and their communities. Communities experience knock-on effects, and the health and social and justice costs borne by the government are huge. Services for young people have to be a priority, and there are other areas where we're falling short. Proper planning for growth in population and demand services has to be a priority, and we're seeing that in public policy across the board, particularly in the outer regions where there are so few services that people actually have to come in centrally to actually get the support that they need. We're also committed to some other, more broad reforms, including the legalisation of cannabis for adult recreational use, which we're progressing through the federal parliament, and it will be a priority for us at a state level going into the next term of government. And we would also like to see some priority given to the proposal around more drug and alcohol services in the interface councils, and that's certainly around that lack of services that I was talking about, the lack of access, access and equity that people, particularly young people in the interface councils, are experiencing, and also for called communities to have culturally specific services for them to be able to address their issues. We're also advocating for 2 new drug courts in Melbourne's West and in regional Victoria. There's good evidence to suggest that drug courts do lower the reoffending and recidivism rates in young people and drug users, and we really need to start looking at different ways of allowing those people to get the help they need through the justice system. We'd also like to tighten the restrictions on both alcohol advertising and incentives to buy in bulk. And again, that's a real issue in the suburbs where there are these big alcohol barns that have these big discounts on alcohol and not a lot else to do. I mean, I'm the mother of 2 teenagers and there's not a lot out there for kids to do when they're at a loose end. We'd also prohibit liquor licensees from irresponsibly advertising or promoting their business or products, including through excessive price discounts, bulk purchase discounts, shopper docket promotions and gift purchases. I'd also like to say that we would like to see in Victoria, as they have just done in the ACT, a trial on pill testing at festivals, but also more broadly in the community, because we also know that that is another measure that saves lives categorically. So in closing, I think we do have a lot to be optimistic about. The government have done some good things in this term of government in terms of injection of resources into the sector, but there's a lot more that needs to be done, and we do need to flip our focus on how we're addressing these issues broadly as a community. Thank you.
Thanks, Nina. Steve Jolly probably doesn't need a lot of introduction because he's well known in the city of Yarra, and Steve is running for the upper house electorate of Northern Metro for the Victorian Socialist Party. Steve is a Yarra councillor, community campaigner and construction worker, and has an extensive background in community activism. Steve formed the Victorian Socialists to give a socialist voice in the Victorian Parliament. Victorian Socialist Party are running candidates in upper house seats across the state, including in Western Victoria, and on top of that they are running 18 lower house seats. Drug law reform and demilitarisation of policing are key goals for his party. I'd also like to say that Steve had a long history of campaigning for a supervised injecting facility, and I think you actually set up a pop-up one in the very mid-90s, around not far from here. So Steve's well known to the City of Yarra, and I invite Steve up here to present on the behalf of his party.
I don't know what your daytime job is, but you could get a job in PR anytime, I'm telling you. First up, I just want to, on behalf of Yarra Council, and it's very, very rare I can say that, as a socialist on Yarra Council, we've got in many ways the most politically divided council in Australia. We very rarely come together and unify consistently from the start to the end of a debate, but around the issue of supervised injecting facilities, the Labor councillors, the Green councillors, the Socialist councillors, the Independent councillors have been rock solid with the community. I notice Judy in the audience, who's played a key role in organising the community in Abbotsford for this, all the health professionals, and of course, not least, the state government, who at the end of the day had to give it the okay. The shame is that it took so long. Back in 1998, 1999, the heroin industry wasn't in Victoria Street, it was in Smith Street. We had at the bottom of the Herald Sun, not only as you still do to this day, the road toll, but it got so bad in those last 2 years of the 1990s that they had next to it the heroin toll. And I think on 1 year it was exactly the same, or maybe the heroin was more. And as you referred to, a group of locals established a community campaign for heroin reform. I was involved with that. And because the epicentre was, as I said, Smith Street, but in particular the corner of Smith Street and Otter Street. There's a very fancy toilet there now, public toilet. Not so fancy, but I wouldn't recommend it to anyone. But
It's a council toilet.
It's a council toilet, so that's why I had to cover my backside there, excuse the pun. But back in the day, it was a red brick, horrific, old school, like 1800 style toilet, and that in a sense was where it was an unsupervised injecting facility. And we saw 7 young people die in that block. And I, with a lot of locals back in 1999, organised what was probably the shortest rally in the history of rallies. We marched from what was then Safeway, what's now Woolies, maybe 60 metres to a safe injecting facility. And as you referred to, it wasn't really a pop-up, but we had a nurse and a doctor, an on-site nurse and a doctor outside. And at the time, Kennett was the Premier. And Steve Bracks was the leader of the Labor Party, leader of the opposition. And he said, if elected, we'll set up a safe injecting facility. And one was established in a church in the CBD, ready to rock and roll, if you remember back then. Then the very unexpected thing happened, which nobody expected. Labor won the election. And the very first thing that happened is that policy went down the gurgler. So we've waited a long, long time for this safe injecting facility. And over the course of the period, from when it was promised in the first place and when we got it, 2,235 Victorians died of heroin overdoses. I'm not suggesting, by the way, that a safe injecting facility in Richmond, if it had been established in 1999, would have saved all those lives. But it would have saved some of them. I don't know about you, but I spent a lot of time over those years going to funerals of friends who'd OD'd because of heroin. And I think it's absolutely outrageous that anyone in politics could ever put votes or perceived loss of votes ahead of saving people's lives, because I'm absolutely convinced that not only Richard, but the vast majority of the Labor Party MPs actually supported the safe injecting facility right from the start, because they're very intelligent people. But whatever decision was made internally was a shame, but better late than never. In terms of what we do from here on in, the low-hanging fruit, as Nina suggested, is pill testing. In my ward, Fitzroy, Collingwood, in nighttime economy, you can buy a pill for $25 a pop. Old school ecstasy tablets back on the market last weekend, $25. Cheaper than a packet of smoke, cheaper than a round of drinks at a fancy bar in Fitzroy, a lot cheaper than a round of drinks in a fancy bar in Fitzroy. The good news, of course, is they kill a lot fewer people than cigarettes and alcohol, and I don't need to tell you about the hypocrisy that we're actually sitting here tonight talking about illicit drug use when the big killers are alcohol and cigarettes. 17,000 a year from cigarettes, 6,000 a year from alcohol. But leaving that aside, because you know that better than I do, the bad news is that no one really knows what's in those pills. Not the consumer, not even the dealer. The only person who knows what's in those pills is the person who made them. And when you're talking about illicit drug manufacturing, it's capitalism on steroids. It's totally run by the private market. There's zero government regulation, and God knows what. And that's why every year we have ODs at festivals, at nightclubs, and especially at day one of CBD festivals, when the police, probably under political pressure, turn up on day one with the dogs, and kids panic, swallow the tablets, 5 or 6 at a pop, and we have incidents, as we had last summer, we've had every summer. So I agree with what's happened in the ACT, I agree with what's happened in Portugal and other places of the world. We desperately need pill testing. We've organised, when I say we, the Socialists have organised over the past couple of years concerts, which our friend in the back here from 3CR and many others have been involved with, to raise money for those people who are actually very bravely, illegally pill testing in the community. And I'll say no more than that. But that shouldn't have to happen. That should be done. It's just I mean, if I went out and started selling alcohol illicitly, which is a very Irish tradition, I have to tell you, I would be charged, because that could potentially kill people. If I started using, illegally imported tobacco from Indonesia or wherever and started selling it, as they do on the high-rise, that's illegal. But selling a pill, no one's checking what's in the pills today, because pill testing is beyond the pale of the current political elite. So that's something that I think is very necessary. The last thing I want to say is you cannot look at drug policy in isolation from the law and order agenda and from the whole debate around prisons and the whole debate about public health and the need for public health. For example, we have here in Victoria a prison population that's increased by 70% in the last decade. It's the highest rate of incarceration in this state now since 1897, and we're spending $1 billion a year on our prisons. The money we spent on Yarra at the state, the government announced it's on the Yarra jail at the last state budget. I've seen the age, they might be topping that up, but maybe that's the Liberals, was $689.5 million. That's twice the spend on new schools. Very welcome spend, I have to say, on new schools by the Labor government. It's twice that amount has gone into Yarra. If you compare that to the $6 million that people like Smart Justice get. So what we've got right now in Victoria, and it's right throughout the Western world, it's in America, it's in Ireland, is that prisons have become warehouses of people who need help. They need housing, they need healthcare, and so on and so forth. 35% of people in prison in Victoria are homeless or were homeless before they went into jail. 46% have got mental health issues, and 44% have taken are intravenous drug users. So, and also there's a class issue. Representing as I do as a ward councillor, obviously Richard has a broader area that he covers as a local MP, but I represent Fitzroy and the Fitzroy and the Collingwood estate, and there's a perception on that estate that drug policy is not only a class issue but also a racial issue. When you look at the fact that 87% of arrests, there's been an increase in 87% over the last 10 years of arrests for drug-related offences, but a decrease in arrests for trafficking. People feel that it's totally hypocritical and they've been targeted. So I think what we need is, well, not in any order of priority, but the first thing we need is to look at diversionary programs in our prison system, in our justice system. You're 6 to 15, depending on what report you read, 6 to 15 times more likely not to be reincarcerated if you're on a diversionary program than if you go to jail and come out again. It's a no-brainer. It has to happen. The only reason it doesn't happen is that it's not very sexy with the Herald Sun and some voters, but I think we need to get over that and be brave. The other thing that we need to do is support our community health centres, support treatment. For every dollar spent on treatment and support for a drug user, that's sorry, I can't read my notes here, so I'll leave that statistic alone for a second. But the rehabilitation rate here in Victoria, the number of rehab beds is 0.69 per 10,000. It's one of the lowest in Australia. So the question of funding public health, all of these things are interlinked. We need, in my opinion, about 200 more rehab beds to somewhat sort of start meeting the need. And some of the work that VAPA and the union, Professional Health Workers Union, that some of you will be members of on this, I think is second to none. The last thing I'll say, the very last thing I'll say is that, look, I'll stick my neck out here, and it's not necessarily the policy of my party, Victorian Socialists, which is an alliance, a coalition, a new coalition of progressive forces of, you know, people from Crikey and unions and community groups and socialist groups all come together to try and have a breakthrough for socialists in the upper house. But my personal opinion is that we've got to decriminalise drugs. We'll never stop people smoking. We'll never, well, maybe that, you know, I'll give you that. But we'll never stop people drinking alcohol. We'll never stop people gambling. We'll never stop people taking drugs. It's just a matter of fact. So therefore, we've got to grow up. And we've got to do like what we do with cigarettes and alcohol. Limit it to people over the age of 18. Limit to where you can buy it. Stop any advertising or limit any advertising. Tax it. And we're just going to start getting real. And as long as we have a law and order approach to drugs, we're going to be here year in, year out. And all of this stuff like pill testing and the safe injecting facility really is just around the edges. Very welcome. Don't get me wrong. I'm not, you know, trust me, I know how important it is. But really, we've got to be really, really brave here and start treating illicit drugs the same way as we treat alcohol and cigarettes. Not necessarily the position of my party, but it's definitely my position. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Look, unfortunately, Fiona Patten has been unable to attend, but we do have the Reason Party's candidate for Richmond here, Ms Judy Ryan. I'd like to welcome Judy to the podium. She's agreed to, in an unprepared way, give a brief talk. I just want to acknowledge Judy's work. Judy's has been a very committed resident in Abbotsford to the issue of reducing the harm of drugs, especially injecting drugs in that area and in the area of North Richmond. And it is not a ridiculous thing to say that her community work with her neighbours and her friends in that area led to the establishment in part of the injecting room. And that needs to be acknowledged, Judy. And so Judy has been a fellow traveller of activism for many people here, including everybody on the panel. So welcome to the podium, Judy.
Thanks, Peter. And look, it's great to be here. I'm no Fiona Patten. I just want to mention her, and I also, Richard and Nina and Steve, yeah, and what you've said, and it's really interesting sitting as a observer and in the audience. Look, I'm pretty much in agreement with all of you, actually, and it's obviously a pretty, we're all on the same program here, but I really, everybody's spoken about the medically supervised injecting room, and pretty much everything's been said, but I really think one of the things upon reflection is how important it is that governments listen to people, because I think one of the issues for me was when we were organising the community campaign is often communities are a long way ahead of politicians with a lot of social issues. I mean, you can't get anything more obvious than the marriage equality issue, which should have happened years and years and years ago, and we shouldn't have waited for a postal vote for that. So none of us out here in community land are surprised with any of this stuff. Sometimes politicians really are. And I sort of don't get that. So maybe if I happen to get up on the 24th of November, I might get some understanding of why they are fearful of things that really just make sense to the rest of us. To that end, I also think about pill testing. Our residents group was part of Matt Knopf's effort in February when they approached Groove in the Mood to get that happening up there. We helped them with PR. They used our You Talk, We Die slogan. We were very proud of that involvement, and it was a great success, and we really support that as a key harm minimisation strategy, and not just the Reason Party but also our residents group. So in the event that I don't get up on the 24th of November, that is something that we will pursue with vigour. The other thing too is I know that the Labor government isn't interested at this point in more licences for medically supervised injecting centres, but we have been contacted by quite a few community groups who disagree with that decision, and we will be working very closely with them in terms of ensuring that there is more than one medically supervised injecting centre in Victoria in the next couple of years. There needs to be more. They work, we know that. None of us are surprised, none of you are surprised, none of you are surprised that people's lives are being saved. And the other really amazing consequence of it, of course, is the reduction in the call out of ambulance services. And I think that is absolutely key here. And not only that, with the I'm on the local reference group for that for the trial, and the fascinating thing for the report, and it's anecdotal yet, I mean they're gathering all the official data, is that the ordering of naloxone has plummeted. You know, and if you just needed one key thing, I mean the residents will tell you the ambulances have stopped because it's no longer like living in Beirut. Oh, hello. Hi there. Yeah, it's no longer like living in Beirut, in North Richmond and Abbotsford, and I'm really not overstating that. It really has been a shocking place to live for residents, and particularly little children and the elderly. But to hear ambulance workers talk about how the impact that it's had on their lives and the fact that they're now redirected to other members of the community is key. And so it then also fits into the law and order issue. This is a health issue. And it's not just about people with addiction, but it's about the broader community who need those services. And we need to seriously look at this stuff. And I'm also with Steve on this decriminalisation. It's just such a no-brainer, and I think there's a bit of an appetite for it out there. There's evidence. I mean, Fiona's travelled, many others here have travelled around the world. Many of you have, I haven't. But I've read a lot of stuff. I look at the justice reinvestment that's being done in Texas, and they're looking at the way they jail people. Well, let's look at diverting some of those funds into something that really works for people. We just have to be brave, you know? That's what it takes. And it's up to us. Politicians, legislators, you guys, residents, and don't be scared. That's it.
Okay, so in the interests of fairness, Judy spoke on behalf of the Reason Party, but I'd like to invite you, Fiona, up to the panel. If it's okay with the other panellists, is there 1 minute that you'd like to say something? Okay, I'll give you 1 minute, but we can't have everyone double up.
Okay, 1 minute. No, all I want to say, and I suspect Judy possibly touched on it, but for this election, we've gone to the Parliamentary Budget Office and asked them how much would it cost to decriminalise the use and possession of drugs. Now, I'm happy to give you more details about it, but they said it will save us $168 million. And we said, how much would it cost if you legalised cannabis and regulated it? And they said it would leave us with $204 million better off. Now, these figures looked at purely the enforcement side of it. They didn't look at the health benefits. They didn't look at the downstream effects of decriminalisation and the ability for people to speak honestly about drug use and the ability for us to speak to people around drug use prior, hopefully, to it becoming problematic. We did a costing on pill testing, a pill testing trial over 8 festivals, a hydromorphone trial and a supervised injecting centre in St Kilda. $24 million that would cost. That's it, to save those lives. Thanks.
Thanks.
All right. Thanks, Peter. He's passed the baton to me for the Q&A. And I think Fiona's 1 minute presentation is a good reminder that what we should be looking at is evidence-based policies. And a lot of what we have at the moment, unfortunately, is not evidence-based. It's based on a whole range of, ideology, moral issues, moral panic-driven policy that we've had for quite a long time, decades actually. So that's slowly starting to turn. It's starting to change internationally. I'm one of the people, Judy, that has been fortunate to travel quite a lot, and I was recently in Canada. I was in Toronto, and they've legalised cannabis there, and it seems to be going okay. You can buy cannabis, you can order online, and the only thing that's holding up the availability of cannabis online is a postal strike, which came a few weeks early. It may extend till Christmas, as postal strikes tend to do, but it seems to be working okay, so which is a good thing.